images, but we can circulate copies of the book and make sure that people can see things. Anyway, let's get started. Hi everyone, my name is Pierce and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series here at Brookline Booksmith and your host for tonight's conversation. I want to open up the space by saying thank you for coming out tonight. The Booksmith has been around since 1961 and that's because of our wonderful community. Your support means we can keep having events like this, so thank you again. As you may know, tonight's event is part of our ongoing Transnational Literature Series, which focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. If you enjoyed tonight's event, please check out our full events lineup online at brooklinebooksmith.com so you don't miss some of the amazing authors we have coming up this spring, both virtually and in store. You can also follow us on Instagram for updates. Toward the end of the event, we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for an audience Q&A followed by a signing. We have copies of tonight's featured book available over at the register. And please take a moment to silence your cell phones. I think that takes care of the business end of things. Now I'd love to tell you a little bit more about our guests. Tonight I have the very great honor of introducing Moshtari, Hilal, and Elisabeth Lauffer. We're here to discuss and celebrate the release of Ugliness, an inventive and ambitious meditation that mixes essay, poetry, and art with personal, cultural, and historical insights to stunning effect. It has received praise from all around the world, including a recent New York Times spread, and it's been called thoughtful, provocative, playful, and truly original by writer Melissa Febos, and a profound, political, engrossing work by author Aishikul Savas. Virginia Nicholson, author of All the Rage, Stories from the Frontline of Beauty, writes that it is a brave, valuable exploration of something we don't usually want to address, and a thoroughly determined attempt to define the indefinable. Moshtari Hilal is a visual artist, writer, and curator based in Hamburg and Berlin. Born in Afghanistan, she pursued Islamic studies and political science in Hamburg, Berlin, and London. And translator Elisabeth Lauffer is the recipient of the 2014 Gute Kunst Translation Prize. After graduating from Wesleyan University, she lived in Berlin and then obtained a master's degree in education from Harvard. I'm so pleased to have them here together in conversation, and I'm Moshtari and Liz.
Thank you so much, Pierce. Thank you to Brookline Booksmith. Thank you to everyone here for coming out. It's kind of nice for me to be back here specifically and looking across the street to the Coolidge Theater. I think I first came to Brookline in 2002 as a 16 or 17-year-old and went to a midnight screening of The Princess Bride in that theater. So this corner was big for me. And it's a huge honor to be back here tonight, particularly for this event. And we're going to open it with a reading from the book by Moshtari.
Thank you. Also, my first time here was an hour ago when I arrived here. And it's also my first time in the US, so I'm very excited to be here with the translation, your translation. And yeah, it's kind of the end of my US book tour, and it's my first time talking to you about the book, so I'm very excited about that. I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, the first couple of pages. Hey, Horseface, where do you get off using my face to grin so sweetly? That's not what I looked like, brushing my hair that morning that wasn't me. I had laid out my clothes the night before, color coordinated with a practiced expression and shy mouth. Where do you get off using my face to grin so sweetly? Now give us a smile. The photographer at our school summons my smile. Give us a smile. And I smiled. Where do you get off using my face to grin so sweetly? I remembered the first YouTube comment I ever got, the comment that made me delete my first video. Hey, Horseface, where do you get off using my face to grin so sweetly? I saw myself in 14 passport photo-sized rectangles, and they gazed back. It It was exactly as A had spelled it out for me in the school hallway. Crooked teeth, long face, big nose. At 14, I learned 14 times over that I'm ugly. 14 someone's making a face in my place on the sheet of photos in my mother's hand. Was my smile a distortion, or did it leave me exposed? "We're not keeping these," I told my mother. "I don't need this picture and I never want to see it again. And I never want this picture to see me." My mother closed the envelope that held my 14 grimacing faces. She placed it folded up in her dresser. "That's my darling daughter. An ugly child only mother could love." I dig up that photo for this book. I search in vain for an ugly horse face. All I find is the picture of a child flashing her teeth, smiling for what will be the last time in 14 years.
Thank you for that opening, Moshtari. In English, we have an expression which is, don't judge a book by its cover. But I would like to start by discussing this cover. You're looking in a mirror, suggesting a split person or a split personality, introducing the theme of doubleness that comes up repeatedly in the book. And the book also incorporates a lot of self-portraiture. So I'm curious, I wonder if you could talk about making this image and what is it showing us?
Maybe it would be also interesting, like in an ideal world, we would project the images that I just described in the first poem in the book, and it's actually also on the cover, on the German cover. And I might also add that I had the privilege to lay out and design my own cover, which is not very usual or normal for the book industry. Usually someone, a graphic designer, just decides what is coming on the cover, but for me it was very important to make that book as an artist because I identify as a visual artist, and this book, I see it as an extension of my visual work. And I worked with a lot of self-portraits to critically position myself, to reflect myself, but from a different kind of a point of view, I tried to create a visual language, an aesthetic that is more inclusive, that is extending our definition of beauty, that is maybe even setting its own aesthetic standards or symbolism. And I worked through these self-portraits when I came across an essay or a text by a disability justice activist and a writer, Mia Mingus, who's also from the US. And Mia Mingus asked these two questions: why are we afraid of ugliness, and what can we learn from ugliness? And these two questions really stick with me, because I never asked myself these questions, like, why am I afraid of ugliness? And I tried to respond to that question. And I think in order to respond to that question, I have to critically remember where my first encounters with feelings of self-hate and ugliness happened or started to get to the surface or started to dominate my self-image. And in order to express that, I do have these self-portraits, because I feel like sometimes it's not easy for an outsider to understand the inner monologues that we have. So I worked a lot with facial dysmorphia or distortion or exaggeration. But I also came across like racist or very pathological illustrations that I didn't want to reproduce. So I just decided to continue with the theme of the self-portrait and like insert myself in all these old illustrations.
And in your writing as well, you you delve into the self-portrait, because we have the school photos, which is one thing, and I feel that it's a very powerful opening, because this feels to me quite a recognizable experience of getting ready for the school portrait, laying out the clothing, practicing your winning smile for the photographer, and then you wait weeks and weeks. This was in the 90s. You wait weeks and weeks, months even, and then the photos come and you're really dismayed, shocked. How could your face have betrayed you in that way? And so we have that, and then over the course of the book, in addition to the visuals you provide, you describe other self-portraits that you do over the course of your life. For instance, as a young girl, you describe drawing yourself as an ideal woman who is largely modeled on the leggy, slender, smooth-skinned American lawyer ladies from TV. This is this ideal: when I grow up, this is who I'm going to be. In another section of the book called Cartography of My Ugliness, you describe another self-portrait that is quite different from that, quite unsparing, really, in your takedown of yourself. And I wonder then, with this interplay between the written word and the visuals that you provide for this book, how your visual practice informed your writing of the book. As a visual artist, what was the switch to the written word like? And how did writing provide you options that don't exist in visual language? And where did written language perhaps fall short?
Yeah, I really like that question, because I'm also wondering, like, am I a writer now, or am I a visual artist still? And to be honest, most of the written imagery, like the descriptive elements, come from visual memory. They come from actual drawings, such as Cartography of My Ugliness. I might have not known the word cartography or colonization or body politics or all these kind of things when I was at that age, but I was doing exactly that. I was mapping my body. I had this drawing where I, first of all, had a very exaggerated version of myself, a caricature that I created, and then I also created an actual plan how to tackle the ugliness. Not the kind of ugliness that you can't change, but the one that you can, through self-discipline, to certain kind of products, to certain kind of procedures and body practices. How can I create the strategy to not be that version, but be a different version? And it is part of this promise to belong, to become someone else, and I describe it in the book also as the promise of assimilation, of self-optimization. And I think cartography is a term that really describes what I was doing as a teenager, not knowing. I was like, trying to conquer like a surface, like a skin. But at the same time, it also links it to the history of colonialism, the history of imperialism, which I think is essentially the framework that we need to understand, where certain kind of ideas of control of the human body comes from. And it was very important to me also to keep the language, make the language sound violent. I wanted to have language that reminds of war, of brutality, because we also often find or reduce beauty to something innocent, to something subjective, coincidental, and I argue that it's not. Beauty has never been innocent, but actually beauty always knows what its outside is, what the non-beautiful is, and also instrumentalizes the non-beautiful to be on the top of that hierarchy. And beauty is actually a very controlling, violent concept. And also not forces but influences us to be very violent to ourselves, because bleaching your skin is not that, superficial. It actually is quite disturbing, as waxing, lasering, and shaving is. And I really wanted to stick in that violence.
And who decides that? Who holds the power to decide what is beautiful and set those standards?
So maybe that's a good moment to go back to the German term Hässlichkeit, because I wrote the book in German, and I think it's very easier to me to explain it in that German term. Ugliness means Hässlichkeit in German, and Hass means hate. So you might already hear it, like you have to pronounce hate, Hass, to get to the term ugliness, Hässlichkeit. And I argue that that hate is actually foundational for Hässlichkeit. You have to know who is hated in our societies and our systems in order to identify who's ugly, who's hässlich. And I also sometimes suggest that when we use the term ugly or hässlich, that we translate it to worthy of hate, hassenswert, because that's what we identify. And I think it's a much more interesting question to ask what kind of societies and systems need Hässlichkeit, need ugliness, rather than to, look up what is ugly. Because the what is ugly can be very contextual. It changes from cultures to cultures. In the past it was different, in the present it's different. But the one thing that stays is the element of othering, the element of exclusion, creating hierarchies. And I argue that most people are not beautiful or ugly. These are like two ideas that create this polar system, these two ends, and we are somewhere in the middle. And we try to be as close as possible to the beautiful, because we know this is where good life lies. This is where the privilege, the benefits, the advantages, and the reward is. And we try to be as far as possible from the ugly, because we know how people are treated that are considered ugly. So we try to have as few similarities to them as possible. So when we realize when we don't like something on our bodies, it's not that individual. Like when we don't like to be fat, it's because we hate fat people in this society. When we don't like to be dark, it's because we don't like dark-skinned people, because our histories have established that they are dehumanized, that they are structurally excluded, that they have less quality of a life, or at least much more difficulties to have a good life. So this is what we actually see when we see ugly. And I think that's the element of power that is much more interesting to analyze, rather than, the who were the ugly ones kind of way ugliness was often analyzed with.
And it seems in this opening passage, it seems to have happened for you at age 14 upon seeing what are truly some of the sweetest photos you've ever seen of a young girl. It seems that this sense of exclusion landed for you for the first time. And I wondered, as I moved through the book and as I've spent time with the book over this past year, over the years that you took in academic study, in preparing this book, in creating these self-portraits, I wonder if it was painful for you to analyze the personal through the lens of the academic, and what it's like to view yourself as a case study, as it were.
I think it's actually interesting that it was not a new thing for me to treat myself as a case study, because I grew up as a refugee in Germany, as a, I know maybe here it's ambiguous what I am or who I am, but in Germany I'm very visible as a foreigner. It's like a less diverse society than in the US, and you're immediately othered as an immigrant, as a person that might be Muslim. And maybe for context, it's also interesting to know that I was in the first grade when we had 9/11, 2001. No one knew what Afghanistan was, and suddenly everyone knew what I was. And it was definitely a demonized identity, and I was basically taught by the news, by the world, that I am a villain. And there was this kind of discourse that made me feel like I have to distance myself from where I come from. But then at the same time, there was also the fact that I lived in Germany, and certain kind of faces and bodies are historically also racially charged. And I tell the story of the nose, because my sister, she had a nose job when I was very young, and I asked myself, like, what's wrong with our nose? Like, why is my sister cutting off the nose that I have? And for this book, I tried to create the context that why do I feel that my nose is not representing my personality? I'm actually not evil, I'm not greedy, I'm not mean, but I had the image that women, or people in general that have like strong features, a lot of contours, a strong profile, a big nose, that they are the bitchy witch, or the greedy neighbor, the mean secretary, or school director. And it's like, because it's coming from caricature and the visual culture that is anti-Semitic, and that was established in Europe, specifically Germany. So I found creating these kind of contexts for my self-image very helpful, to use myself as a case study, but then always remove it again. And that was also, for me, the process to be able to not believe in these things, because I created context for them, and I realized that's not my idea. Where did I get it from? Yeah.
With that specific example, I am curious about the section in the book where you discuss the nose job that your sister had and your feelings around it. And I am curious about the fact that your father commented on his daughter's noses and said, "Oh, such beautiful girls, but their noses," and where that perspective from him would have come from.
Yeah, this is very funny, because so basically there's only one line in my book where I mention my father, and it's him saying that all his daughters have long faces and long noses, and he loves them despite that fact and not because of that fact. And when the New York Times review came out, they picked up that line. And he sent, my father doesn't speak English, and he sent, also not German, so he never read my book. But he was very proud that it was in the New York Times, and he sent it to all his friends, and I had to tell him, like, so by the way, the only line that mentions you is like critical. So it's a really mean representation of my father. He also said very nice things, but he said that as well. And I think it's interesting, right? Where is it coming from? And Afghanistan, due to war and poverty, has not a very, established plastic surgery practice, and most people are just too poor to care about these things. But we can look at Iran, which is like a neighboring country, and people look similar. And in Iran, for instance, we have one of the highest rates of nose surgeries. But these people do not try to look German. Like, if you ask them on the street, they're not saying that they want to be German. They try to look modern, urban, rich. And the big nose is labeled, what is, yes, exactly, thank you for translating.
Provincial.
Aqib Monda, provincial. And that's very interesting, because we don't have the words European or white in it. But if you look back into history, like, when did the people start having nose job and how did it become a trend? It's the elites and the aristocracy that starts imitating white, Western, European specifically, beauty practices, and also the way they dress, and coloring their hair, doing the nose job, because they wanted to belong to the global elites, and people in Iran want to become their own aristocratic elites. So it is kind of interesting that even if on the surface it's not about whiteness for the people, if you look back into, if you create a little bit of historic and political context, it is always the wish to be considered, to be recognized as cosmopolitan, as global elite, as rich or modern.
Thank you for that. We've already been talking about some of these topics, but I would like to get into some of the more political aspects of this book. And already I've heard you using the term othering a couple of times, and at this point I feel quite familiar with it, having done this book. And in thinking about tonight's event and preparing, and we were chatting about it earlier, one thing I'm struck by is the casual use of what were originally academic terms that may have been taken from areas of social science, psychology, words like othering, like gaslighting, even something like hegemony, that might come up and just be sort of tossed about very, very loosely in social media posts, in forums that perhaps lack a certain kind of rigor. And I would love then if you could describe or define for us how you understand othering, especially from a German perspective, because although many of the themes discussed in this book can be applied to the Western world and even perhaps globally, you are writing from a German perspective. And so I would love to hear a bit about how you view othering in the German context. And if you could also talk about how ugliness functions as a means of othering, and how that othering gives rise to hatred and control.
Yeah, actually, it's really interesting to talk a little bit more about these big words that we're using. And when I started writing the book, the first thing that I told my editor was, I don't want this book to sound like a social justice book, because the moment it does, people are closing. They don't want to engage with it because it's already like charged, and people are annoyed by, I don't know, by just being like criticized and all these kind of things. So I really tried to find a descriptive language that describes things such as colonialism, othering, capitalism, without just using the words, but actually create like a historical, emotional landscape that allows the reader to understand without having the knowledge about the word. But of course it's hard. I mean, I have not that much space to give as much context, so sometimes, these terms have to be used. But I really tried my best to also break down certain kind of feelings that are attached to political processes such as othering in my poems, or in the more subjective, more personal memories, because I think this is when sometimes people start to understand, and really when you invite them in an emotional reflection and process. So I wrote the book in a way where I allow myself to be a little bit eclectic within, the multiple genres. Like, is it a memoir? Is it an artist book? Is it a nonfiction? Sometimes it feels like it's theory, and then suddenly you have like a poem, and then I'm talking about my sister, because this is how, for me, research feels. Like when I read a book by Sandra Gilman about the history of plastic surgery, and it's about a certain kind of surgeon doing a certain kind of measurement, I remember something my art teacher told me about how to measure noses in order to draw them. And this might have been the first time when I realized, oh, my nose doesn't fit the scheme, the anatomy of the face that is being taught in school. So I think this is how our brains work, and that's how I try to describe or write. And I'm not sure if I responded to your question because I went in another direction. But I think it's very hard because I imagined also when I wrote different kind of audiences, but my priority was to write this book for myself. But of course I knew I would have like readers and critics that have a lot of knowledge already and expect a certain kind of political analysis. But then I knew this book can also only work if anyone can read it, who's not familiar with, I don't know, body positivity movements or the decolonization of aesthetic theory.
And I have to say, it was the timing of this project for me was quite remarkable, because when I started translating this book last year, I had just finished translating an academic work by a professor at Yale named Fatima El-Tayeb, whose book is called Un-German: Racialized Otherness in Post-Cold War Europe. And I mean, which couldn't have been more to the point. I mean, the similarities between the texts were truly astounding. But there, of course, highly academic, highly specialized language, where I became very familiar and quite versed in what then you went into in such really touching, beautiful detail, and the artistic and personal and poetic and lyrical components that your book then introduced to the themes of otherization, of alterity, which is a word that I used in the first draft of this translation, and my editor said this is too academic, so I had to strike that. It was a really humanizing approach to this background that I had gained through this other work, and really expanded. I mean, you see then the power of art to take what might seem like really arcane, elevated, impenetrable ideas and make it truly accessible, and make it accessible in different languages, in visual language, in written language. And that's me saying thank you for this work and for what you accomplished in making accessible to all sorts of readers. And
thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. This can become a back and forth, a thank you, no thank you. And I am very curious, being the translator of this book, and obviously you speak brilliant English, and you studied in London, and you consume a lot of English media, as many people do around the world, and certainly for this book, you were, the research and the scholars you cite were mostly writing in English. And I wonder what it felt like for you to suddenly encounter your own work mirrored back to you, as it were, a different kind of self-portrait perhaps, in English. And it's been translated into other languages, as I understand too. So how has it felt to see different versions of yourself represented in different languages?
Yeah, I want to thank you for the English translation, and that I was also, involved in it in the editing process, which is a very unique experience because the Italian translation also came out, but I just had to, trust the translator because I don't understand Italian, but in the English translation I was like, being unable to read it and to understand and to appreciate it, because I do see my text in it, I do see myself in it, but still it's in a way a foreign voice. And I'm very happy about the English translation because I can be part of a bigger conversation, and I also got some feedback by some of the authors that I'm citing, and they're able to read it. So it's like, for me it's in a way a possibility to step out of the provinciality of the German discourse. So like, I really appreciate that. But at the same time, it's also interesting how German this book became, because I'm talking in the US or in Italy and I'm talking to the outside world, because it's for me, not a very German book, but apparently it is. And I think it's also interesting that my experience being here is people ask me where I'm from and they wait for me to say German because of my accent, and it gives away and it's very humiliating. I tried to get rid of this accent and it's not working. And this is so funny to me because racialization here works so different than in Germany, but also in Italy it was a very different experience. Usually people thought I'm Italian until I was not able to speak Italian. So I think depending on who I'm talking to, this book will be received very differently. But the main argument is one that is valid anywhere when it comes to the analysis of power. I think it's very interesting because maybe like an anecdote also from my writing process in Italy. I finished writing the book at my art residency in Italy, and yeah, as I said, like most of the women looked very, very similar to me, and I wondered like if I grew up in Italy I would have not written a whole chapter about the nose. This is so ridiculous. And I also came across an artwork by an Afghan artist who is Hazara, which is like a visually very different ethnic group in Afghanistan that was historically marginalized and also enslaved, and they fight for the recognition of the genocide. And they look a little bit more East Asian, and this artist made a whole collage, like an art piece, about the fact that she has no big nose and is being discriminated because of it. And I found it again astonishing how I wish, growing up in Germany, I wish I had like a smaller nose like her, but she grew up in Afghanistan and was discriminated because of her small nose. So it is very contextual, and I appreciate that a lot, to be able to talk to different audiences. And actually I'm waiting for a Farsi translation because I think it would be nice to speak about the nose in one of the major centers of nose surgery. So yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Perhaps on YouTube we can put out the call for translators into Farsi. Are we nearing? Okay, we're going to open the floor to audience questions, but first we're going to finish up with a bilingual reading from the volume. And we haven't practiced this, so we'll try to be simultaneous and not too staggered. Ready? Dream body.
Tagträume werden
become
Bau, werden
blueprints,
Schlachtpläne.
then battle plans. A
Ein
skinny
dürres Kind
kid doubles
überschlägt
over.
sich.
She
Es
slaps her
ohrfeigt seine
thighs,
Schenkel,
hangs
hängt sich
herself
an seinen
up
behaarten
by her
Achseln
hairy
auf.
armpits. She
Es kratzt
scratches
sich
her
die
stubbly
staubigen Arme
arms and
und bläst
puffs
sich
up
die kleinen
her flat
Brüste auf.
chest. She
Es nimmt
takes an
das Bein
axe
und
and
hackt
chops
sich
her
die
nose
Nase in
in
zwei
two.
Teile.
One
Den
piece
einen
is
Teil
buried,
begräbt es,
the
den
other
anderen legt es
placed
der
in her
Mutter
mother's
in ihre
calloused
rauen Hände.
hands.
Mutter,
I
ich
am
ziehe in
going
eine
into
Schlacht
battle with
mit meiner
blade to
Klinge
cheek,
an meiner
your
Wange,
daughter under
mit
my
deiner
blade.
Tochter an meiner Klinge.
Close enough.
I just got chills. I've been doing this a long time. No one has ever done that. That was beautiful. Time for all of your questions. I'm going to pass the mic around. Any first takers? Yeah, one in the back.
Thank you very much. I was curious if in your book you talk about the ultimate hair color in Germany and around the world, blonde.
I do not talk about blonde hair without using it as a comparison to black hair, to be honest. I think the chapter about hair, body hair, and body hair removal really centers about around the fact that only when hair is visible on the surface of the skin, it's being racially charged and seen as an issue. And the brighter it is, the more invisible it is, and the more neutral it's considered. But I think I'm not specifically talking about blonde hair, but definitely about whiteness. So yeah, I guess that's part of it.
I'm coming right to you.
Thank you for its coming in the United States. And actually, I'm from Azerbaijan, and I thought that we are the middle of nurse surgery operations, but now, yeah, no, where's the second part? Actually, after all your life experience, all the work that you made for during your studies, during your booking writing, what you can say after all that way, what you can say for yourself now?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure how you felt reading it, but I do not think that the book gives any solutions to the issues. It's actually only pointing out to problems, and I also don't want to create the expectation that this could be a book that leads to more self-love. I think there were a couple of reviews that said it helps to have less self-hate because it takes away the hate from the self and creates this history of hate. But I do not see the book as like a wellness or self-improvement book, and I think for me it was also very important to argue that it doesn't matter how confident we are as individuals. If the world around us is structured in a way that wants to put us down, it will happen. Like, it doesn't matter how confidently we confront that. If the reaction is violent enough, it will put us in that place again. So it is kind of hard. I mean, also like on a personal level, there's one thing to intellectualize these things, and there's another thing to really feel it and feel it every day that way. And because we're speaking here about embodied knowledge, like the way our bodies react to being perceived, to be seen, to relate to others. So in a good day, when I'm confident, I can embody what I want to embody, what I believe in. But in a bad day, I feel like the 14-year-old girl. So I think it's very hard to have like to really unlearn these concepts of beauty, belonging, ugliness, what is normal, what is healthy, what is modern, what is civilization, because these things have a lot of power in our culture. And I think that ideally we would live in a world where value for life, for beings is not exclusive. And only when it's not exclusive, we don't have to compete. And when we don't have to compete, these hierarchies are obsolete and have no meaning. But as long as we have this culture, but also economic systems where we have like an artificial shortage of resources, and these resources can be water, but these resources can also be attention, space, privilege, and so on, there will always be new concepts that make us believe that some people are more worthy of having a good life than the others. And so it doesn't matter if we unlearn beauty, it will be something else. And so when I talk about beauty and ugliness, it's like just two terms in the bigger picture of dehumanization and justification of exploitation. So I don't know if I responded to your question, but yeah. So sometimes I don't feel ugly, sometimes I do.
Thanks for coming. I suppose this question's directed at both of you in a way. You talked about the original German title and the word hate that's kind of embedded in there, and that's fascinating, but it's also something that doesn't really come across in the English word ugliness. I was wondering if there were any other moments or areas of the book where you encountered that sort of thing that wasn't able to be translated into English and what you ended up doing about it.
Yeah, this very central play on words, the Hass and Hässlichkeit. I had to bracket the original German and put the root of Hässlichkeit, put Hass in bold to drive this point home. I didn't do a footnote. I steered clear of the footnote, but I did feel that I had to represent what this very central argument was that Moshtari was making. There were a couple other spots. It was in the section about plastic surgery that I found the most instances where the English and German didn't quite line up. For instance, the term most commonly used for plastic surgery, you did also use plastische Chirurgie, but the most common term in German is Schönheits-OP, which is beauty operation. And so I ran through the options in English, and the closest would be cosmetic surgery or aesthetic surgery, which cosmetic surgery maybe you do hear fairly commonly. Aesthetic surgery I certainly don't think is as common as plastic surgery, or euphemistically getting work done, which is a euphemism that doesn't exist in German. And I use it once, and I did a search in my original manuscript to see if I had used it, and then compared it to the German. And the German is much more clinical. It's this young girl had an operation, and so there, in that instance, I found the euphemistic English term actually quite a bit better because it sort of smooths over the reality of being operated on. And in the other instances, I tended to use plastic surgery or cosmetic surgery because it's the most commonly used here. But something was lost with the Schönheit, the beauty being baked into the term that is used for this kind of intervention, as it were.
Another word would be the word that I read in the beginning, horseface.
Oh yeah.
Because in German it's, I think, a much more brutal word. It's Pferdefresse. And Fresse is a really mean, what is it? A really mean word for mouth.
Yeah, for face and for face or mouth, and it's the sound of it, and it's something you say if you tell someone to shut their trap, or which is also really not a nice thing to say in English, but you just say Fresse halten. And it's true, that is, I'm glad you bring that one up, because that was one where also I wasn't, in fact, I had first translated that as horsey, because I imagined kind of a schoolyard taunt of calling someone, hey, horsey. And I believe you corrected it because you had seen horseface used in certain social media, in fact.
Yeah, I felt like horsey sounded so cute, and Pferdefresse is not cute at all.
Yeah.
And I came across this website. I'm not sure if it's like horseface.com, but it's actually a website where they collected pictures of celebrities that have long faces and big noses, such as Sarah Jessica Parker, like Terry, like from this one show from the 90s. So I meant that word.
Yeah.
And I have never heard it before, but I knew that in Germany these people would be called Pferdefresse, so I knew this must be the word. But still, like sometimes German is a very hard language and very specific. In English is a little bit more descriptive, while in German you can like combine a lot of words and invent new words by combining words. So I thought it's really interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I'm really glad you bring that one up, and I'm very glad that you advocated for us to change it to horseface. And another instance that I remember is schöne Fratze. And Fratze it sounds kind of similar to Fresse, and it describes a face, And in this case, it's schöne, which means beautiful or pretty, schöne Fratze. So you have this juxtaposition, this kind of this incongruity between these words. And the closest I found I could come in English was to use the word mug, that ugly mug. And so it was a beautiful mug or a pretty mug. But the fact is that poem is describing a scene between young girls. And Fratze, I can imagine being used between two, preteens or teen girls. And mug is maybe a little bit more old-fashioned and wouldn't come up necessarily. So leaning perhaps on the sense that it's an older narrator or protagonist in that poem. But yeah, those were some instances. And one last instance that I remember from that section, and we were texting about it earlier. Moshtari uses the word zinken in German, which I translated as, I believe, as beak for nose. And I was going through all of the lovely hurtful terms that can be used for a big nose: honker, beak, snout, schnoz, which is an especially interesting one because coming from Yiddish, which derives from Schnauze, which is the German term for an animal's muzzle. But schnoz didn't feel right to use in this book, even with the anti-Semitism that is thematized in this book. It was too embedded in the U.S. vernacular, and it felt like a bit of a leap that wouldn't have fit.
I think we have one last question.
Hi, so when I was reading your book, one thing that stood out to me as someone who grew up very online with social media is your inclusion of certain Instagram posts and I believe also Snapchat posts. And I guess what I'm wondering is social media as a platform to or a way for us to be exposed to different people and new faces, but at the same time the billionaires owning these companies are really curating this algorithm so we see the beautiful faces, right? I guess I'm wondering what are your thoughts about the future of social media in creating sort of these hierarchies that you talk a lot about, and where do you see do you think the population will sort of get to a point where we start kind of controlling our own algorithms, or do you think, I guess, the elite will kind of continue to control that?
Yeah, I think that's a very challenging question because I don't know. And I also have a very complicated relationship with these platforms. I do love them in the sense of they're tools that I can use for myself. I can connect with other people. They are actually a site of alternative media production, discourse. It can be very progressive, it can be very revolutionary. This is why it's being limited, right? This is why you have this TikTok ban for a night. These platforms are very challenging places for not only us, but also for those who are in power, because they're not easy to control. And still, as you said, they are being owned by billionaires and by people who have agendas and interests. And one big interest of these platforms is to make us spend as much time as possible there, because we are paying with our attention. And I think it's hard to resist that, because we often consume the content passively. It's when we are lazy and sleepy or not focused when we are on those platforms, and that's why we are also so vulnerable and also easy to be not confronted, but just infiltrated with things that we don't even want to consume. It just happens to us. I mean, I try to be so critical, but if you look at my For You page, it's horrible. It's right now Timothy Chalamet and Kylie Jenner and I don't know, like nose job stuff. It's like, I thought I'm over that. I'm not. And it's still there because even if I hate it, I look at it. And yeah, it's really hard, and that's why I also work with the term seeing habits, because often the reason why we're not able to imagine us differently or imagine relationships differently, or why we react allergic or confused towards other difference or ambivalence, or just people who are deviant of whatever this controlled image is because we're not used to see it, because we're not engaging with it, and we're engaging with this very polished and produced image of what it means to be a woman or human or whatever. And ideally we would practice that as such, like curate our own things that we consume, and be have also maybe like a social media hygiene in a way where we are like, I'm blocking this, I'm not going to interact with this. And maybe that's a way that could empower us a little bit more, or give us more agency by not passively entering these spaces, but with a guard, to be like, this is not a neutral space. Someone is trying to sell me something all the time, and probably also influence me to have a certain kind of opinion. Like, really have a guard up when we are there.
I think that's a great last question. Thank you, Kaylee. Anyway, thank you all so much for coming out tonight. We're going to have this signing. You can come up here and Moshtari will sign. We've got books in the back. Thank you all so much.